In the late 1970s, at the height of the Cold War, a quiet storm was forming. Deep inside the Soviet Union's counterintelligence apparatus, the KGB's Second Chief Directorate had begun to notice something unsettling: patterns of movement, unusual signals, and unexplained gaps in security. Logs that suggested a foreign service had infiltrated the country more deeply than anyone had anticipated. For years, the CIA had attempted to cultivate reliable sources within Soviet scientific institutes, military facilities, and ministries. Most of these efforts were detected early, dismantled quickly, and erased from official memory. But one network, constructed carefully, patiently, and with exceptional discipline, managed to evade attention longer than expected. The CIA's plan relied on a small group of Soviet citizens with access to sensitive information, not at the core of state secrets, but close enough to observe, infer, and report on technological shifts, weapons programs, and political moods inside the Kremlin. These individuals were recruited through cautious, indirect approaches: a conversation abroad, a trusted intermediary, or a subtle ideological appeal. Each step was measured, tested, and verified, allowing the agency to build a network that appeared nearly invisible. The information flowing out of Moscow was fragmentary, but valuable. It allowed analysts in Langley to estimate production rates of strategic missile components, understand internal debates within the Politburo, and evaluate the real progress of Soviet nuclear modernization. Yet invisibility is never permanent. In 1981, the KGB intercepted a single message, not the content, which was encrypted beyond immediate recognition, but the circumstances of its transmission. A dead drop container, recovered by accident during a routine sweep in a Moscow suburb, triggered a chain reaction of suspicion. When analysts examined the object, they realized it matched the design of containers previously attributed to Western intelligence services. Plastic residue, scrape marks, and traces of foreign adhesive materials pointed unmistakably toward external involvement. The discovery was minor in appearance, yet significant in implication. Someone inside the Soviet system was communicating with an outside power. The KGB responded quietly. There were no arrests, no public statements, no abrupt surveillance maneuvers that might alert the CIA's operatives. Instead, officers began reconstructing patterns of movement around the recovered drop site. They cross-referenced transportation logs, analyzed the routines of local residents, and studied the timing of the dead drop against known American diplomatic traffic. Slowly, a picture emerged, incomplete, but coherent enough to suggest method, structure, and purpose. What appeared at first to be an isolated data leak revealed the outlines of a coordinated espionage network functioning inside the Soviet Union. The CIA, unaware of the discovery, continued to operate under the assumption that its procedures remained uncompromised. Messages were exchanged, signals were flashed, and couriers performed scheduled tasks. Langley analysts believed they were tracking strategic Soviet developments with unprecedented clarity. What they did not know was that the KGB had begun to trace the invisible threads, connecting each agent, each handler, and each transfer of information. The collapse of the operation had already started, silently, meticulously, and without a single warning to those who thought they remained unseen. By early 1982, the KGB's investigation had evolved into a covert, highly compartmentalized operation known internally as a silent net. Only a handful of senior officers were aware of its existence, and even fewer understood its scope. The objective was not merely to identify individual informants, but to uncover the entire architecture of the CIA's infiltration strategy. The KGB sought to map every point of contact, every method of communication, and every potential vulnerability that the American service might have relied upon. The approach was deliberate: patience, observation, and non-interference until the full network could be reconstructed. The first breakthrough came through a mistake, not by the CIA, but by one of the Soviet collaborators they believed they had successfully recruited. A mid-level researcher at a scientific institute deviated from established communication protocols, visiting a restricted site without prior clearance. The incident drew attention from internal security officers, who began monitoring his movements more closely. His pattern of behavior, when cross-referenced with the KGB's earlier dead drop discovery, pointed to a possible link. The KGB's analysts examined his contacts, his travel history, and even subtle financial inconsistencies. The conclusion was unmistakable: he was part of the unknown network. Rather than arrest him, the KGB allowed him to continue operating. They monitored the signals he attempted to send, sometimes subtly delaying their delivery to observe his response. They watched his interactions with foreign visitors, analyzed his coded notes, and traced his path to locations that matched suspected CIA meeting points. The officers assigned to the case understood that surveillance alone would not reveal the full scale of the American effort. They needed to push deeper into the structure that supported him. At the same time, the CIA was growing increasingly confident. A series of successful reports delivered to Langley suggested that the Soviet Union was experiencing internal tensions over defense spending, pointing to disagreements within the military-industrial complex. The agency believed it had gained access to rare, nuanced insight. In Washington, policymakers relied on these assessments for shaping both diplomatic and strategic decisions. Yet no one considered that the source material might soon be compromised, or that Soviet counterintelligence was already quietly siphoning the network secrets for its own purposes. As the KGB expanded its silent net, they began identifying anomalies in communication. Traffic around American diplomats stationed in Moscow, routine trips to cultural events, embassy receptions, and administrative errands took on new significance. When viewed through the lens of overlapping timelines, a pattern emerged. Seemingly mundane outings coincided with the movement of several suspected Soviet agents. This convergence allowed KGB surveillance teams to position themselves strategically, observing actions without revealing their presence. Every small inconsistency, every unexpected turn or deviation, reinforced the operational picture forming inside Lubyanka's walls. By mid-year, the KGB had successfully linked 3 individuals to the CIA's clandestine effort. They represented different backgrounds, different motivations, and different levels of access. But they shared one operational characteristic: standardized communication procedures that bore the unmistakable signature of Western intelligence training. This discovery strengthened the KGB's confidence that the network was structured, disciplined, and managed by experienced officers overseas. What remained unclear was the identity of the CIA handler responsible for coordinating the agents. Without locating that central figure, the operation could not be considered fully understood. The KGB's leadership insisted on maintaining absolute secrecy. Not a single suspect had been detained or questioned. The goal was not immediate disruption. It was total exposure. The officers involved believed they were on the threshold of revealing one of the most sophisticated espionage operations ever attempted inside the Soviet Union. And as the net tightened, they understood that each step, each observed contact, brought them closer to the moment when the entire structure of the CIA's network would finally stand in the open, vulnerable, traceable, and destined for collapse. By late 1982, the KGB's surveillance efforts began to produce a clearer picture of the CIA's operational design. Analysts reconstructed the likely chain of communication, identifying how fragments of intelligence moved from individual Soviet sources through clandestine channels toward American diplomatic cover officers. The structure resembled a tiered system, compartmentalized, efficient, and intended to withstand the loss of any single participant. Yet the CIA had underestimated the KGB's ability to piece together behavioral patterns across multiple domains: transport logs, telephone traces, foreign visitor registries, and even subtle shifts in workplace routines. One of the most significant advances came when the KGB detected an unusual sequence of light signals on the outskirts of Moscow. Initially dismissed as a malfunctioning street lamp, the pattern was later recognized by a counterintelligence specialist as a possible form of short-range communication. Surveillance teams were deployed discreetly, and over several nights they recorded a sequence that corresponded to known signal protocols used by Western services during covert exchanges. The discovery implied that an American officer had established a consistent point of contact and was likely coordinating messages with at least one member of the Soviet network. Instead of intervening, the KGB expanded its observation perimeter. They positioned agents in civilian clothing near tram stops, residential courtyards, and alleyways bordering the suspected signal site. The goal was to track who, if anyone, responded to the coded flashes. After several days, a pattern emerged. A Soviet engineer with access to restricted military production data appeared near the location at unusually regular intervals. His movements matched the timing of the signals, suggesting that he was receiving instructions or confirmations. This connection placed him at the center of the expanding espionage map. The CIA, meanwhile, was unaware that its carefully crafted system was unraveling from the edges. Reports continued to flow steadily from Moscow, and although some appeared delayed or slightly less detailed than usual, the deviations were not considered alarming. At Langley, analysts attributed the inconsistencies to routine operational friction, the unpredictability inherent in running human sources inside a hostile state. No one suspected that the KGB was quietly intercepting indicators, tracing patterns, and reconstructing the architecture of the entire operation. Inside Lubyanka, the KGB's leadership debated the optimal moment to strike. Some officers argued for immediate arrest to prevent further intelligence leaks, while others advocated for continued surveillance to uncover the handler directing the network. The latter view prevailed. The KGB believed that if they could identify the American officer coordinating the agents, they would not only dismantle the existing network but also gain insight into broader CIA strategies. Capturing the operational logic behind the infiltration would be more valuable than any single arrest. To achieve this, the KGB introduced a subtle pressure tactic. They manipulated certain environmental conditions around known meeting points, adjusting police patrol routes, staging minor construction near observation zones, and modifying traffic flows. These changes were not intended to block CIA activities, but to test how the handler adapted. Every shift in behavior, every deviation from routine, revealed something about the individual's training, experience, and operational priorities. Counterintelligence officers documented each reaction, feeding the information into an expanding analytical model. Gradually, the KGB identified a narrowed list of suspects within the American diplomatic community. One figure in particular stood out, a cultural attaché whose movements, while outwardly mundane, displayed a consistent pattern of brief, unscheduled detours at moments that corresponded to known dead-drop exchanges. His background suggested fluency in Russian, familiarity with Soviet society, and prior assignments in regions where CIA operations often disguised personnel under cultural or academic cover. Although no single piece of evidence confirmed his role, the accumulation of indicators pointed strongly toward him as the network's central coordinator. As winter approached, the KGB believed they were closing in on the decisive moment. The silent net had revealed connections among sources, communication points, and now, possibly, the CIA handler, responsible for orchestrating the operation. What remained was a final test, observing a full exchange, from signal to retrieval, without being detected. Only then could the KGB move with certainty, ensuring that when the operation collapsed, it would do so completely and irreversibly. In early 1983, the KGB prepared for the most delicate phase of the operation, capturing a complete, uninterrupted cycle of CIA communication. This would require the kind of precision that left no room for improvisation. Surveillance teams were rotated to avoid recognizable patterns. Equipment was replaced with upgraded models capable of detecting low-intensity radio bursts, and analysts refined their models predicting when and where the next exchange might occur. Every officer involved understood that the slightest miscalculation could alert the CIA handler, forcing the network to dissolve before the KGB could expose its full structure. The breakthrough came on a cold February evening, when a field unit detected a short, directional radio pulse near a wooded area adjacent to a tram line. The signal lasted less than a second, brief enough to be overlooked in normal circumstances but distinct enough to raise suspicion. Among trained listeners, minutes later, a second pulse followed, matching frequencies associated with compact, standardized transmitters known to be used by Western intelligence for short-range communication. The KGB redirected multiple surveillance teams to the area, deploying them in concentric layers to monitor all potential approach routes. Within an hour, the figure of the suspected American cultural attaché appeared near the tram stop. His behavior, although outwardly casual, revealed traces of operational caution, pausing to adjust a glove, turning slightly to observe reflections in a shop window, walking at a rhythm inconsistent with typical pedestrian flow. These subtle signals were not proof of espionage on their own, but their alignment with the timing of the radio pulses created a convincing operational picture. The KGB monitored him as he proceeded toward a concealed location near the woods, where microsignals could be transmitted or received without attracting attention. What followed provided the KGB with its clearest insight yet. At the far end of the wooded path, a Soviet engineer, the same individual, previously linked to the light signal communications, arrived shortly after the attaché departed. His steps were quick, purposeful, and directed toward a cluster of trees where officers believed a dead drop might be hidden. From a distance, KGB observers recorded him retrieving a small object, pausing to inspect its surface, then concealing it within his coat before returning to the tramline. The object was not intercepted on this occasion. The goal was to observe, not intervene. But the sequence, captured in full, confirmed the operational link the KGB had been seeking. Inside KGB headquarters, analysts dissected the event. The timing, route selection, and communication pattern all pointed toward an orchestrated meeting designed to minimize risk while transferring classified material. With this confirmation, the KGB began constructing a dossier that outlined every known movement of the American attaché over several months. Travel logs, social engagements, and diplomatic functions were mapped onto surveillance data, revealing a network of subtle but deliberate detours. Each detour aligned with known or suspected meeting points used by the Soviet agents. The CIA, meanwhile, sensed none of what was unfolding. From their perspective, the Moscow operation remained functional, though somewhat strained by the tightening Soviet security environment. A few anomalies, delayed messages, ambiguous signals, inconsistent feedback raised mild concerns, but not enough to trigger emergency protocols. Langley analysts believed they still possessed a reliable window into Soviet scientific and defense developments. What they did not realize was that many of the delays and inconsistencies were engineered by the KGB, who sought to observe the CIA's reaction to minor disruptions. Each response offered clues about the agency's operational discipline and fallback procedures. As the KGB's confidence grew, so did the scope of the investigation. More officers were assigned, though still under strict secrecy. The second chief directorate began coordinating with regional branches to identify additional communication points the handler might use. They tracked the engineers' movements beyond Moscow, discovering unexplained trips to provincial research facilities. These excursions suggested the network was not confined to the capital, but extended into areas linked with strategic weapons development. The implications were serious. The CIA might have been gathering data on missile production cycles, electronic warfare research, or early-stage nuclear modernization projects. The KGB leadership recognized the gravity of the situation. They were no longer dealing with a small cluster of informants but a structured operation, potentially capable of influencing geopolitical strategy. The decision was made to prepare for a coordinated strike that would neutralize the network in a single, irreversible action. But before that could happen, one final objective remained: identifying every peripheral actor who might support the operation. No loose ends could be allowed to escape. The collapse, when it came, had to be absolute. By mid-1983, the KGB's operation had reached its decisive stage. Months of silent observation, layered surveillance, and meticulous pattern analysis had given Soviet counterintelligence a rare, panoramic view of an entire CIA network functioning on their territory. Every key participant had been identified, every communication method catalogued, every meeting point mapped. The only task remaining was to bring the entire structure down without alerting a single operative before the moment of arrest. It required coordination across multiple directorates, regional offices, and specialized units, all operating under the strictest secrecy. The KGB leadership authorized the final phase under a directive that emphasized speed and simultaneity. The arrests would occur within a narrow time window, preventing any member of the network from issuing a warning or destroying evidence. Teams were assigned to each target, instructed to move only when they received an encrypted signal from Lubyanka. Meanwhile, surveillance continued without interruption, ensuring that none of the suspects deviated from routine or sensed the tightening trap around them. The first arrest took place just after dawn, when KGB officers intercepted the Soviet engineer responsible for transporting classified material. The operation was quiet and precise. He was detained while exiting his apartment before reaching his place of work or making contact with any intermediary. Within minutes, simultaneous arrests unfolded across Moscow, at a research institute, an administrative office, and a residential neighborhood where a low-level courier lived. Each suspect was isolated, questioned separately, and denied any knowledge of the others. The goal was not only to collect confessions, but to prevent communication that might distort the investigation. At the same moment, attention shifted to the suspected CIA handler. Because he operated under diplomatic cover, the KGB could not simply detain him without triggering an international scandal. Instead, they implemented a strategy designed to sever his operational capabilities without immediate confrontation. Surveillance teams recorded his movements, while diplomatic channels quietly prepared formal complaints regarding activities incompatible with diplomatic status. The CIA officer, unaware that his network had collapsed, attempted to send a scheduled signal later that week. The KGB intercepted it, analyzing the content and logging it as further evidence before allowing the embassy to receive a subtle but unmistakable warning that the officers' activities were under scrutiny. Within days, the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs delivered an official note to the U.S. Embassy, declaring the attaché persona non grata. The expulsion was sudden, framed as a response to unspecified violations. For the CIA, the message was clear. The Moscow operation was compromised. But the scale of the collapse was not immediately evident. Only after internal debriefings in Washington did the agency begin to understand the depth of the exposure. Reports ceased entirely, communication channels went dark, and every attempt to re-establish contact with sources failed. It became apparent that the KGB had dismantled the network not piece by piece, but in a single coordinated movement. Inside the Soviet Union, the aftermath unfolded in quiet, controlled stages. Several arrested individuals faced trial behind closed doors. Others cooperated in exchange for reduced sentences, providing details about recruitment methods, communication protocols, and the motivations that led them into clandestine work. Their testimonies confirmed what the KGB already suspected. The CIA had invested years into cultivating a network designed to monitor Soviet weapons development, internal political dynamics, and strategic decision-making. The operation had been ambitious, methodical, and, until its exposure, unexpectedly resilient. For the KGB, the successful interception and dismantling of the network became a case study in counterintelligence precision. Analysts documented each phase of the investigation, creating internal reports that would later shape Soviet approaches to foreign espionage for the rest of the decade. The lessons were clear. No operation, no matter how carefully constructed, could remain invisible indefinitely. Human behavior always left traces, and disciplined observation could reveal even the most concealed structures. By the end of the year, the CIA had withdrawn or reassigned several officers associated with the Moscow station. The agency conducted its own internal reviews, attempting to determine how the network had been exposed. Some attributed it to operational errors, others to the increasingly sophisticated capabilities of Soviet counterintelligence. Yet the conclusion shared quietly among analysts was more sobering. The KGB had simply outmaneuvered them. The collapse of the operation marked not just a tactical loss, but a strategic reminder of the risks inherent in penetrating one of the world's most tightly guarded intelligence environments. The Cold War would continue, with new operations replacing old ones. But this episode entered the unofficial histories of both services. For the CIA, it was a cautionary tale. For the KGB, it was a quiet triumph, a demonstration of methodical, relentless counterintelligence work that had turned a concealed American spy network into a fully exposed, irreversibly dismantled system. In the shadows of global rivalry, it stood as one of the clearest examples of how information, patience, and precision could alter the course of clandestine conflict.